So thanks everyone for joining us. So our first speaker today is Paul Hume from Victoria University of Wellington, who will talk about long-range exciton diffusion in a non-fullerene acceptor approaching the incoherent limit. So Paul, when you're ready, please.
Oh, thanks, Bronson. And thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to you all. It's really great. So I have hopefully what I'm hoping is a reasonably self-contained piece of work that we published earlier this year. And I mean, it's kind of in the title, but basically it's a theoretical modeling study of exciton diffusion in an organic solar cell material. And I mean, I think given that I'm talking at AUCAOS, I can probably assume that that most of you are familiar with the motivations for organic solar cells and roughly how they work. But I just wanted to start out by highlighting how central exciton diffusion is to their function. So, and the reason it's so different from silicon is, of course, that when you have a photoexcitation in an organic material, you form an exciton rather than free charges. And so the way you get around that is by having a blend system of two materials, a donor and an acceptor, and you split the excitons through a charge transfer reaction between them. But in order for that to happen, the exciton has to be able to reach the other material. So so that's this part here. Can you guys see my mouse?
Yes, yeah, we see your mouse.
Oh, thank goodness. Yeah, so the exciton diffusion length is a key parameter, obviously, because it essentially defines how small your domains have to be for your excitons to be efficiently converted into charges. And OPVs have, so the question of exciton diffusion is really closely linked to the development of these new next generation non-fullerene acceptor molecules, which are essentially molecular acceptors. And these have been really exciting. They've driven a sort of quite rapid increase in OPV efficiency over the last 5 or so years. And they have a lot of advantages over fullerenes. They're molecular materials, so they're a lot easier to tune in a synthetic sense. They tend to be highly crystalline, even in thin films, which means that we have a lot more information about how molecules are arranged in a functional organic solar cell. And I've colored these sort of orange and purple to sort of indicate that they tend to have this, except electron deficient, electron rich, electron deficient alternating pattern. And that means that they have very large quadrupole. They tend to have very large quadrupole moments, which, although it's not a huge factor in what I'm going to present, is, I think, probably the key to a lot of their properties. But the main exciting thing about these, for me, is that they come with a lot of really exciting and interesting new photophysics. Obviously, they absorb a lot more light than fullerenes ever did. But even more than that, you have things that are sort of changing how organic solar cells look. So one big thing that Justin's group published a couple of years ago was that the exciton diffusion lengths in these materials are much larger than before. So we did some measurements on IDIC, which is this one here on the left, and they were able to show that you have these very large diffusion coefficients, and that corresponds to a large exciton diffusion length, which means that you don't have to have such finely intermixed donor and acceptor layers in your solar cell. And, you know, there's another paper last year where people sort of extended that work and expanded it to a much larger group of these molecular fused ring electron acceptors. And they showed that, you know, these large exciton diffusion lengths are a fairly general property of this class of materials. And that's quite exciting because it means you can start to think about organic solar cell architectures that aren't bulk heterojunctions. So Justin, for example, has a paper that I think came out this year where they do bilayer organic solar cells that are just as efficient as the corresponding bulk heterojunctions. I should have put the reference here, but I forgot. And the other nice thing is that having these two papers essentially measure the same thing, is we now have like quite a lot of confidence in the value for IDIC, because this reference to it also measured IDIC diffusion coefficient, and it did it in two ways. So it did they did fluence dependent transient absorption spectroscopy and also bilayer quenching measurements. So we have a reasonable degree of confidence in those values now. And so for me, that kind of raises two questions. The first one is kind of a fundamental question. It's, you know, why is the exciton diffusion so effective in these materials? And then the second question is a more practical one. It's like, can we model it? And if we can we use that to sort of take a step towards virtual screening of OPV materials? And so the starting point for the way that we would model it would normally be sort of an incoherent energy transfer theory. So essentially Forster theory. And if you get Forster theory on a microscopic molecular level, it takes a really simple form. So you have the rate of energy transfer between molecules I and J is equal to the square of the electronic coupling times the spectral overlap. And the spectral overlap is, you know, essentially the overlap of the emission spectrum and the absorption spectrum. But I think of it as an energy conservation condition. So it essentially encodes energy conservation so that during the energy transfer process, you don't violate energy conservation, which is generally considered to be bad. If you expand that out, it gets pretty horrendous. And it looks ugly, but it's actually made up of different quantities that you can actually access using computational chemistry. So obviously the electronic coupling is still in there. And, you know, you've got your reorganization energy, your site energies, which are, you know, not always the same if you have disorder in your system. And then you also have these sort of nuclear wave function overlap terms. But I don't want to dwell on how you would calculate all those quantities, but I mainly just want to point out that they are accessible, and it's not that hard to get them from pretty standard, you know, DFT calculations. The two I would focus on would be the electronic coupling, which I'll talk about more in a second, and the site energies. But the site energies, you could do some pretty heavy-handed stuff to try and model them, but I think you can actually get quite far by just drawing random numbers from a Gaussian distribution according to some disorder width. Yeah. So, and that's what I'm going to do in in the following slides. So this would be our general structure strategy for modeling exciton transport in IDIC. And there's nothing particularly innovative about this approach. So we would take the crystal structure, if I can work my mouse. We take the crystal structure and we extract, molecular geometries and pair geometries and use those to calculate the coupling, the reorganization energy, the nuclear overlaps. So we get those, and then to introduce, disorder and randomness into the couplings and the energy, we use the experimentally determined temperature-dependent PL, which gives you the disorder width. So that gives you sort of the disorder in your energy. And then we do a molecular dynamics simulation of like a supercell, and use that to kind of at least take a guess at the disorder in the coupling. And so that gives you all the parameters that you need to calculate the rates of energy transfer. So you can just feed all those parameters into a giant Monte Carlo simulation and calculate your diffusion lengths simply by starting, an exciton off in the middle of a giant supercell and letting it wander, and then doing it again and doing it again, and then averaging the results. So for IDIC, the parameter that I think is probably the most challenging to get right is the electronic coupling between your molecules. So the way that we did this was we took a sort of two-pronged approach. So when two molecules are far apart from one another and you don't have any wave function overlap, you can use this sort of Coulomb type expression, which is called atomic transition charges. So you decompose the transition density into point charges for each atom, and then you just add up all the Coulomb interactions between them. So that's great, but at close range, it starts to fail because, well, at close range, there's a deviation between having point charges and the actual transition density, but also new physics starts to come into play. So you start to have overlap and exchange effects. So for the short range couplings, we used a method that we developed last year, which is essentially a resolution of the identity. The basic idea is that you calculate the excited states of a pair structure of molecules, and then you also calculate a reference system where they're separated from one another and they don't have any overlap effects. And then you can get the coupling between those reference states by projecting them onto the states of the pair in the actual crystal geometry. And that's quite important because, there are other ways of getting close range couplings in the literature, and there are some what I think are really good ways, but a lot of them suffer in IDIC because in IDIC that there's actually intermolecular charge transfer states that are very close in energy to the exciton states, and that really complicates how to use and interpret those methods. So the key advantage of our way of doing it was that was mainly that by separating the molecules and making these reference states, we had a really clear character of our reference states, as in like charge transfer versus exciton. The other thing you have to worry about with the couplings is is disorder in them. So there's this paper, this PRL paper from a few years back, which is pretty well known, which looked at how electronic couplings get modulated due to thermal motion in anthracene crystals. And the big takeaway from that was that the fluctuation in coupling can be pretty wild. And so it's not always that appropriate to simply calculate the couplings like we were doing between, crystal geometries. And we weren't able to exactly replicate that for IDIC because the molecule is so big. But what we could do is calculate sort of time-dependent molecular orbital overlap fluctuations. And I mean, I won't go into the details of that because it's pretty dry, but basically you can sort of get an estimate for the disorder associated with your electronic couplings. And the take-home message is that the fluctuations are quite large, but the mean overlap is quite small. And so what that works out to is that the disorder, the fluctuation in the coupling due to sort of short range interactions is actually effectively, well, is pretty negligible. It's sort of less than 10% or something like that. So that means that we can draw our disorder for our couplings from sort of a Gaussian distribution of a width of about 10%. And once we have those couplings, we can do a Monte Carlo simulation. And so the results of that are here. On the left-hand side, this is the diffusion coefficient, the time-dependent diffusion coefficient. And on the right, we have the time-dependent diffusion length. But like from where this one sort of bottoms out, you can see that these values are actually really quite close to what was measured for IDIC. So 10 and 23 was kind of the range that Justin had put for the disorder in our sample of IDIC. And the predicted diffusion length is really close. So we were really happy about that. And the other paper, the Nature Comms paper, they actually measured a slightly larger disorder width for their sample of IDIC, and our Monte Carlo agrees quite well with that too. So that was really nice. So, I mean, it's always nice to match up with experiment, but the key question for us is, why is it so fast? And so there's a few things that I think, from working through this exercise that we kind of learned. So obviously the low energetic disorder is important because you don't want to get trapped low in the density of states and have nowhere to go. But even more than that, I think the fact that these molecules are so large and they actually have quite limited pi stacking, that means that, at least in the crystal geometry, that overlap effects on the electronic coupling are quite minor. And so that means that when the packing structure sort of gets modulated by static or thermal disorder, you're only really modulating what is only a quite small contribution to the coupling. So you don't have this really wild variation in your electronic coupling, and that means that that you don't get trapped, and that you don't get slowed down by thermal effects, and it also means that it's much easier to model. And so the last thing we kind of did, because I've got an eye on the time, is we sort of looked at, can we simplify things, or can we cheat and not do a Monte Carlo model at all? And so for that, we just did a really simple, we kind of still randomized all our side energies and couplings and stuff, but we just calculated a diffusion coefficient that was a weighted average of rates to each of the neighbors. And it turns out that if you do that, you can get pretty good predictions of how the diffusivity changes with so this here is different levels of energetic disorder, and this is different levels of coupling disorder. And if I just go back, these dashed lines here, those were the predictions from the sort of quick and dirty way of predicting the diffusivity. So it's that, I just included that because that kind of speaks to the point I had earlier about, the question as to, can we use it for virtual screening? So this was a very tentative step in that direction. So just to wrap up, the key takeaway is that, this exciton diffusion in these materials is modelable, and the crystal structure and the temperature-dependent photoluminescence are the only experimental inputs. And you don't even strictly need the PL, like you can just treat the disorder as a variable parameter. And one of the main reasons it's modelable is that, so even though if you calculate the total transfer rates, you don't violate incoherent energy transfer theory, but you get kind of uncomfortably close at times. But I think because the couplings don't fluctuate so strongly, you don't have this effect that you kind of stay away from the effect where thermal modulations lead to sort of transient moments of very high of coherence. And so that's quite nice from a practical prediction standpoint. But in terms of questions going forward, I think it's an interesting question to ask, why is the disorder so low? My suspicion is that it's because the crystal packing gets controlled by the quadrupolar nature of these molecules. There's also a need, because of what I was saying about getting uncomfortably close to coherence, there's a need to move to sort of intermediate, semi-delocalized ways of calculating things. And then there's also these questions about other materials like Y6, who have extensive pi contacts, and seeing how their couplings would fluctuate with temperature, because these molecules are also known to have high exciton diffusion lengths. So it's not simply that the overlap in IDIC is small. I think that's only part of the picture. So that's me. I'd just like to obviously acknowledge the people I worked with. Dr. Wanting Chen, who was very patient with my ignorance of molecular dynamics simulations, and Professor Justin Hodgkiss, who is supportive and really helped get this one through. And more broadly, I'd like to just thank my group, the Hodgkiss group, and the friends I have there for their support, and of course, funding support and computing support. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm sure that everyone would join me in kind of a virtual round of applause in the Zoom format. So I'd like to just quickly open up for questions. So please, if you would like to ask a question, just unmute yourself. I see, Ivan, you've turned your camera on, so if you want to...
I've even put my virtual hand up, so that doesn't have a question. So thank you, Paul, for an excellent talk. I have a few questions. I mean, one of them I think is actually an experimental question, but it's what's the lifetime of the excitons in this case? And so it kind of connects to one of your slides where you had the time-dependent diffusion constant, and we see similar things that it depends very much on the time. And so what's the appropriate time that's being measured in the experiment?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of disagreement on this point between those two papers, so our lifetime was about 128 picoseconds, and the Nature Comms one, it was about double that. So there's a bit of uncertainty, which I think is tied to it's quite, the excitons move so fast in these things that it's quite hard to get to a low fluence enough so that you don't have bimolecular effects that make it decay artificially fast. Yeah, so that's around the time scale.
Thank you.
Were there any other questions?
Yes. I can ask a question.
Go ahead.
I was just wondering about whether the exciton transport was sort of isotropic, or since you're saying these are quite crystalline materials, whether you see very fast transport along, say, one crystal axis and slow transport along the others.
Yeah, I didn't look into that as much as I should have, but it's a really good question. I think that from memory, just from looking at the box and seeing all the trajectories, which is not very not very rigorous, I know, but it seemed pretty isotropic. But I don't think that will always be the case. So in the unit cell, there's just, it's quite messy.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing Monte Carlo, it might be worth just keeping track of kind of, the direction of the hops, relative to the molecular axis or something like that. And then you might be able to pick that information out really easily.
Yeah. No, I definitely should have done that. Yeah.
Oh. Future direction.
So thanks. Yeah.
No, good talk. Thanks.
We're a little bit over time, so I think we will have to stop there for any further questions. If you want to stick around after both of the seminars are finished, then I guess we can have further discussion for people who are interested in doing that. But thank you very much, Paul. Excellent talk, very interesting, and yeah, very keen to. Obviously, it's something that's attracted a lot of interest. We have quite a good turnout here in this session, so that's great.
Thanks.
All right, so we'll move on